Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Quartier. I am a journalist for Fleet Europe, and I am very happy to welcome you in this fourth session, this fourth deep dive webinar in our Fleet Week, which is dedicated entirely to LCV fleets, so commercial vehicle fleets. A very warm welcome to our sponsor today, which is Fleet Logistics. And well, the title of today's session is Delivering the Lowest Possible LCV TCO. We all know what TCO is, or at least we think we know what TCO is, but I'm sure there's still quite a few elements out there that might require a bit more explanation and that are quite, let's say, tricky to handle. And that's, I'm sure, something that you will learn more about in today's session. Before we start, I would like to focus your attention on the fact that this is being recorded and the recording will be available after this session. The session is for informative purposes only, so this is not a session that you should consider as a binding or a strict advisory session. And so that brings me to the presenters of today. We have two presenters today, two people from Fleet Logistics. And the first person that will take the stage is Madelaine Webster, who is Global Consulting Manager at Fleet Logistics. And in about 15 to 20 minutes time, she will pass the microphone, so to speak, to her colleague, Kellner-Steinmetz, who is the Chief Sales Officer at Fleet Logistics Group. So welcome to you both. And well, before we get started, I would like to briefly introduce the subject of TCO. So cost of ownership of your LCV fleet depends on a multitude of elements, ranging from selecting the right finance, the right model for your fleet, mastering and monitoring, of course, the fuel efficiency, safety, driving behavior, taxation, tax breaks. There's a lot of elements out there, and of course, anticipating trends, not to be forgotten. In this deep dive webinar, sponsored by Fleet Logistics, you will get insights into the TCO equation and hopefully get some guidelines and some tips and advice from our speakers, who are indeed Madelaine and Samuel. So with this, I would like to give the stage to Madelaine for her part of today's deep dive webinar. Madelaine, welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Dieter. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just share my screen.
Is it working from your side, Madelaine?
Yeah, it worked fine in the test.
It did work fine in the test, but
it worked fine in the test.
So your screen just yet, and I think it's coming. Yes. Before I forget, yes. Before I forget, I would like to invite the audience also to, of course, to submit their questions through the chat function. So to the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a chat function, and you can see a Q&A, and there you can, of course, submit everything you want to our speakers of today. And then at the end of the session, we will have plenty of time to answer your questions. So you may gain some interesting information straight from our speakers of today. And yes, indeed, we have your presentation right now, Madelaine. Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay, Samuel, are you going to start?
Yes, happy to do so. Happy to do so. Thanks, Madeleine, and thanks, Dieter. Thank you for the quick intro and for recapping what TCO is standing for. What an interesting topic today, especially in connection with LCV. That's not something that you can read much about in the press usually. So we're excited to share our experience. So what are we going to do the next, let's say, 20 25 minutes of our presentation, and then afterwards we'll have time for the Q&A. So please think about things that you're interested in, so we can have a discussion. So first of all, we're gonna give a quick recap about the market trends. Now, I think if you have joined the lessons before, you have received quite some interesting inputs there already. We just want to give a quick catch up on that. Then we will quickly discuss defining TCO. Dieter, I love that you said TCO. Is that really everything? That's really true. I would like to challenge that word TCO, because actually it should be TCM. More about this later on. Then we're going to talk about different approaches and potential savings that can be done, and then we'll discuss the key steps to lower the TCO, and then we already have the Q&A. So to start off, just a quick recap who Fleet Logistics is and what we're standing for, so you will understand. This is the basis of what everything we're gonna talk to you about today. This is what we'll get our know-how from. We've been around for 25 years. We're in more than 27 countries. We have more than 350 employees worldwide, and we cover for about 170 clients, more than 180,000 objects or units, in the areas of fleet management, reporting, global reporting, and so on. And in our 25 years of experience, we have learned one thing that is very, very important, and that is consulting. We need to provide proper consulting. For this purpose, we've set up our own consulting department, which is the reason why Madelaine is here today. She's one of our international professional consultants. And the areas that we basically offer, that we basically cover with that, is mobility advisory. It's anything about costs or sustainability, or the shift to mobility. We cover analytics, anything that has to do with reporting, which is global dashboards, scenario builders, mobility budgets, and so on. And then last but not least, we've also learned most important is research for us. We need to know what we're talking about. Now, on the one hand, we've got the practical experience from working 25 years with customers, but on the other hand, we also need to do some scientific research. And that's also what this department is doing. This is also what our presentation today is based upon. And that's why I thought it would be worth mentioning the source or the roots of everything we're going to share with you today. We do publicate sometimes white papers or any activities of that kind. So let's jump into the matter, and back to you, Madelaine.
Thanks, Samuel. So it's interesting, we thought, to start with a brief overview of the trends in sales over the last few years. As fuel makes up such a large percentage of fleet operating spend, it's interesting to see the evolution of this in particular. The macroeconomic factors that influence oil price may be impossible for us to control. However, fuel consumption, mileage, and energy efficiency can be, as well as ways to control where drivers fill up and what they pay when they do so. With fuel, it's all about changing habits and adopting technology in this area. Unfortunately, this isn't something we can cover in great detail in the time today with limited time, but we'll cover the trends and the main points that we can. So firstly, we know it's a diesel dominant market with just under 2 million diesel LCVs sold in 2019. Fuel type composition has been stable in the market over the last 6 to 7 years. Between 2014 and 2019, the market for petrol vehicles has tripled, reaching just below 100,000 in 2019. Diesel over the same period increased by over 500,000. However, this does highlight a change and shows that fleet operators are now looking at different options. This is further demonstrated by the interest from both OEMs and in the market in eLCVs. 1.25% of total sales in 2019 were eLCVs, and that's 26,000 compared to just 21,000 in 2018. So again, it just signifies the shift. And alternatively, fuel powertrains now make up 2.8% of total sales, with gas at 1.3%. So that means that 0.3 of LCVs on EU roads are now electrically chargeable in some way. With increased sales comes an increased CO2 emission, and they grew by 0.4% in 2019. So that's now an average of just under 160 grams per kilometres. I think we all understand it's been a very challenging time for businesses around the globe as a result of the pandemic. Automotive as a sector has not escaped this, with many production sites affected, so supply has been affected due to lockdowns, and the uncertainty of the economic environment has affected demand in various market segments negatively. However, despite the difficult financial times and climate, the LCV market momentum is growing, and we're seeing more businesses focus now on the opportunities that new working practices have presented. The market is seeing an acceleration in the transition to the new technologies that are out there, again, helped by the OEMs bringing a great variety of product in all shapes and sizes for the LCV market, and many future models announced. We also have the UN Climate Change Conference this year, COP26, in my hometown of Glasgow in November. And it's great that business fleets are so now engaged in the bigger picture when it comes to decarbonisation. As well as OEM product making some massive advances, we're seeing now falling prices in battery tech developments, and governments encouraging uptake with tax and purchase incentives, as well as infrastructure incentives too. However, as with TCO, for all of this topic, not one approach is the same for every single business. It's from an operational and needs perspective. This means each business needs to map their own distinct journey for the process to net zero. However, I'm not going to talk too much about that, as I believe a couple of the leasing companies have already covered that this week in detail for you. Okay, so before I hand back to Samuel, an observation that I'd like to make, just to add some context to this and how TCO or TCM, as Samuel said, is evolving. An observation we've made in all industry segments is now that fleet managers are, yes, looking to reduce their expenditure. However, it's not all about cost anymore. A lot of it takes into account the organisational goals. So do they want to rationalise fleet? Do we want to become carbon neutral by 2030? This means that fleet now more than ever involves more stakeholders. So are you in an industry where budgets are very much under pressure? Is the top agenda sustainability, my favourite subject? Is it you need to be moving with the competition in your space? Or is it part of overall of the mobility journey and how you're going to map that out? So this can mean HR, finance, procurement, fleet, sustainability managers, and with EV infrastructure playing a part now, also facilities need to be involved. So our advice is that everybody needs to be aligned on what you're working towards as an organisation before the review of TCO is undertaken. Samuel.
Thank you.
Back to you.
Thank you very much for this interesting overview. What I want to discuss here is the following. When we talk about TCO, the total cost of ownership, everybody's aware that we want to reduce costs. And the obvious pillars for that are, of course, how do we acquire our vehicles? What about the maintenance and the service? What about the tires? And what about the fuel? Now, that is typically the standard anybody would get when you ask for a leasing offer, if you want a full service leasing offer. But as same as an iceberg, there can be certain costs hidden that are not obvious in the first moment. I think we all know about this. And this is why I say, when we talk about TCO, we should actually talk about TCM, standing for total cost of mobility, because these are the real costs that are coming along. And this is not what you will see on your monthly overview of your lease rates, including the maintenance rates and the tires and the fuel. There are certain extra positions that always have to be considered. And that is actually also an area where most of the costs are hidden and where an active TCO or TCM management can really bring very big differences. Now, the areas are listed here. I don't want to point out every single one of them, but if you think about it, you will see that they make sense. certain taxes, disposal costs, recycling of fittings. I think those second two points here on that list are most important for LCVs, because the LCV market to resell is a very specific one. It's not the standard one that will work for any passenger car platform. You need specific buyers for that, and that has a very strong influence. Not only if you're selling these cars yourself, you should also be aware of what is my leasing provider, for example, doing, and how are they selling these cars? Are they able to provide proper residual values, which will then again impact my lease rate in a very interesting way. Then the topic of fittings. Nobody discusses with the passenger car what the extras are in the car, but with LCVs, it does have a very big influence. Certain fittings in the back of the cars to cover certain tools or whatever you would need there can be substantially expensive. And the question is, should they just go back to the leaser when it's over, or be sold with the car, or can they be recycled, or can they be used for the next term of a car? And so the story continues. Last but not least, we all know there are certain costs which are always hidden, like certain supplier admin fees, things that would be in the terms and conditions of your lease contract that you would not be specifically directly aware of, but they can be quite some costs. Damages at the end of the contract. How can you manage that? Is that just the training of the employees? How they're driving the cars? Did they drive more careful? So as you see, there is a number of areas that has a real strong impact on your real costs of mobility. And it will be our challenge today to trigger or show some of these and also show a methodology of how you can make sure that you cover every area and get the optimum out for yourself, so you can reduce your costs and follow the goals of your company in a perfect way. So moving forward to show what we're talking about, these are some real experiences from some of our customers that we've been working with. Now, basically, if you look at these numbers, these are just some examples of of real savings customers had by simply applying a very close look at the costs of mobility. And you will see that this is ranging between 1 to 4 million, depending on the amount of vehicles in scope and depending on, of course, of the time. But that's just about what you could save in 1 year if you have an average fleet of at least, let's say, 1,500 vehicles upwards. That's when these things become really starting to get a real impact on you. And then just two quick notes on average experience we have. So if you do a full supply chain assessment, on average you make roughly almost 8% of savings. Yeah, that's if you cover the full supply chain. If you would only cover a supplier tender, if you would do that regularly, then the average saving that you could get from that is around 4.3%. And as I said, depending on how big your fleet is, that can be substantially much money. And in times like these, this is what we are looking for, right? Now, Madelaine, this one we will do together, right? You will guide us through the topics, and I will be sharing some experiences or some examples of how this has worked.
Okay, so thanks, Samuel. Lowering TCO. So this will be a very busy slide, and it's a busy slide for a reason. There's a huge amount of categories and spend and in scope that we could discuss. But what we've done today is just talk through the methodology with you of how we would advise you to approach with this. So preparation, as we've covered, is key at the first stage. As we discussed, aligning with the order, with the organisational goals, and baselining your TCO is so crucial in this process, knowing what your spend is to start with. So next, we would suggest that right-sizing the vehicles and engines, right fueling, and defining your vehicle specifications based on actual usage is the next part. Now, this is where your lease companies, your telematics providers, your mileage capture solutions can all contribute to sourcing this data for you. And it is worth the effort, as Samuel showed you on the previous slides. So once you know the type of engine, the type of size of vehicle that you're using, an OEM review and tender would be the next step that we would advise. So here, define your term and mileage, and it may be you're with an OEM that still has the best product range for you, but it is worth checking because there's so many developments in the market at the moment. So once you've done your shortlist, it's time to really look and see if, as well, you can harmonise product. So if you're operating perhaps in different markets, is it something that you can do to bring that together to leverage the volumes and increase your discounts, increase your buying terms, and also, of course, the bonuses that you may receive from the OEMs. And I think, Samuel, you've got a really good example to share with us of an experience.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. Indeed. You know, as you were talking about the OEM review and the tendering, one thing that's really crucially important for your total costs is the rebates you can get from OEMs. And one would assume that this is something everybody, of course, is aware of and is collecting accordingly as a company. Now, our experience has shown that this is not always the case. Very often, certain companies are really talking to the OEMs and aligning certain rebates. Usually, that's for the local countries that they want to have these discounts or rebates for. Now, what some of the companies really quite often forget, and that's really the puzzling thing, is there's a certain amount of certain rebates you can get. It's not just that one rebate you get for this one country. If you have a substantial size of fleet and you are purchasing a certain amount of vehicles per year, you will also get an international discount that can be collected. And all you have to do is talk to the OEM and do this. But even further, you know, once you, let's say you do collect the overall international rebate and then the local rebate for each of the countries that you're purchasing, of course, you can also get a retail rebate on top of that if you simply are connecting with some dealerships, for example, who would then often be also willing to give you any additional rebates then as well. Now, you see, there's a number of topics that just need to be addressed, and sometimes it's just needed that you have a certain advisor who will let you know about this, and then you collect it and you make quite some savings in your TCM. Back to you, Madelaine.
Thanks, Samuel. Thank you. Okay, so after that, the next step is to define your sourcing strategy and look at your acquisition methods. And this is one where certainly in the last 18 months, almost 18 months now anyway, we've seen a huge amount of sale and leaseback inquiries in the industry. And that's for purchase fleets where they're maybe looking to get some money back into the business. And that, of course, gives a cash injection. So whatever your purchase method, it is really worthwhile checking periodically to make sure that you're buying the category of vehicles that you're buying in the best way for your business. And your leasing company, fleet management company, our partners will help you with that. Oh, sorry, something's popped up. There we go. So once you've done that and you're confident in the way that you're buying is right, define your sourcing strategy by considering the different scenarios that are available. So sole supply and pulling everything together in the one place reduces complexity, which I think we can all agree is a good thing at the moment. However, sole supply isn't right for everybody. So sometimes multi-supply, dual supply, so that leasing companies, for example, are bidding against each other for every order, or perhaps you want to go down the batch order route and order in chunks. That can also be a really good way to save some additional money. And certainly one that I looked at recently was 3-4% overall, 3.7% I think it worked out in the end overall by going down the batch route, which can be done obviously with LCVs sometimes easier than cars when it's down to the driver to pick specific specs, but of course still possible. Okay, moving on, now looking at in life. Minimising maintenance downtime is key in running an LCV fleet, and whether you select budgeted maintenance by a third party, this may differ in between markets, of course. Again, reviewing that is something to do to start with. Minimising, oh, sorry about that, everyone. Technical troubles. Yeah, and looking at the services that are now available, there's so many new providers up there, as well as the traditional lease companies and big maintenance providers that may work well for you. So out of hours service, looking at mobile services and weekends, that's a great place to save on downtime. After that, pinpoint and monitoring the actual needs of the drivers to look for flexibility, and this is where telematics can play a huge part, and unfortunately we don't have time today to go into all the wonderful ways telematics can help you with data. However, it's great to be able to see the actual usage of vehicles, how they are being utilised, when they're being utilised, and perhaps different sizes of vehicles aren't always needed. So there's flexible options there for rental vehicles, maybe for larger vehicles if they're only used a couple of times a quarter, for example, to no point in having dead time with vehicles sitting around in a garage or a storage compound. So then reviewing mileages and amending contracts. The leasing companies are all saying that there's a record number of extensions carried out, perhaps not surprisingly, over the pandemic. And that presents opportunities while the OEMs are bringing out new products to really give you the chance to review what you're going to replace those with. But mileages are always a guess to a certain extent. Yes, we try and write them an actual mileage, but they are always a guess to a certain extent. So make sure at the moment that you're looking at your pooling arrangement and making sure it works, or utilising Matrix if that's available to you. This may sound like a really obvious one. However, invoice control and processing is something we see time and time again, not being used, not being utilised to leverage savings where they can be. Exception reporting and identifying where there has been incorrect charges, the wrong tariff used, can save a huge amount of money. I mean, one that I saw recently was in one market, fleet of only about 100 vehicles, and because a wrong tariff had been placed into the invoicing system, this client was billed by £30,000 more than they should have been by one supplier in 1 year, which was picked up and corrected. So not done deliberately, of course, but these things can happen. So that's another way to really ensure that if you have a robust cost-saving and transparent way to verify that your costs are correct, can really leverage savings. Driver training improves safety, improves actual MPG and maintenance costs. We all know that, but with the reduction of LCVs, it's even more important. They're more predictable. We know more from an ELCV when it's likely to be downtime and dwelling because it's being charged. So this can all be planned, and changing driver behaviour needs to be considered more. Habits will play a huge part in success of ELCVs, and that will be down to your drivers adopting the technology. The research and feedback suggests that drivers are far happier in ELCVs and the environment they create, and of course a happy and less stressed driver is only a good thing. And if that has an impact on the business costs as well, even better. And finally, I think Samuel's going to again give us a great example of resale and disposal costs and a client that he worked with. But yeah, really checking your resale and disposal options is a great thing to do in terms of lowering your TCO. Sam, do you want to, sorry, do you want to discuss this?
Yeah, happy to do so. As I mentioned in the intro, what happens at the end of a, let's say, leasing time of a vehicle really has a major impact on your overall costs. And with LCVs, the fittings in the back of the car have an even greater impact. Sometimes they cost about a third of the total cost of the car itself. So if these fittings can be reused, then there's a substantial saving there. Now, I had this one experience with a customer who had a really substantially big fleet. All of them needed fittings, and they didn't have a very strong harmonization of the types of vehicles that we're using. And as such, they had to sell the fitting almost every time with the LCV when the leasing time was over. And then they would purchase a new fitting for the new car to be delivered. So what happened was we organized a workshop and discussed the details. And the outcome was, of course, we need to harmonize the types of vehicles we're using. So the fittings in the back can be exchanged if a certain car runs out and can be used for the next one, or can be used for another car that has maybe been redundant or whatever. But just to give more flexibility in reusing and recycling the extra fittings, the extra equipment that comes along with LCVs. And that's really very specific for LCV fleet, which you usually don't have with passenger cars. That has a major impact on your costs. Yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Madeleine.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So once you've done all this work, it's really important to monitor the results. With EVs, for example, it may be a pilot and you really want to see the true success, which means more costs being added into your TCO perhaps because you have infrastructure costs, additional fuel suppliers, the driver training that we've just spoken about, and adopting different ways of working to think about. However, data really is power, and monitoring the categories of spend helps identify what could be next on your roadmap. And that's for drivers as well, making sure that they're using the latest technology, apps, for example, to give you the information that you need to make strategic decisions. Nowadays, leasing companies, fleet management companies all have robust software, and data from all suppliers can usually be consolidated. Now, that might be something that you've got the resource and the time to do in-house, which is great, but it may, if you don't, please, I encourage you to use an external party to do this, because it really will give you some really great insights into what your spend truly is in that area. Connectivity and predicting downtime and maintenance is something that will only improve as the technology evolves, and we're even now seeing some of the OEMs offering tech to aid with this free of charge in the LCV market. Okay, so Samuel, can I ask you to cover the key steps for us, please, that we've covered today?
Exactly. Thank you very much. We're here now at the summary of the main points. As you see, this is a very big topic, and it's hard to discuss it in roughly 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Our intention was to trigger and to give you some ideas of areas that you should take a look at. But when you do so, there's a certain, let's say, waterfall diagram that would really work to ensure that you cover really every area there is. And here you see it. First of all, you need to be clear about what are our goals, where do we want to go, what is the main objective that we have. Really think about this at first. Then the next thing is you need to make sure you understand the status quo, and data and reporting is key to that. Have an understanding of what your fleet is really consisting of, where are certain gaps, and so on. This is what's very important. Then once that is clear, it really makes sense to review the supply chain. Think about the OEMs. Think about your suppliership model in terms of financing, if it's leasing, if it's purchasing, if you want to do multi-supply or single supply. Every single one of these solutions can be the perfect one. Not one size fits for all. It's just a way how to set it up and to optimize it. Now, after this area being thought about, then of course checking out for best practice. That's that's so important. We have the Fleet Europe Forum. You have the chance to align with other peers. You have the chance to align in general with other companies to see how they're doing these things. We are living in a time now where there's a vast change. Electric mobility is moving forward. Mobility, other forms of mobility are just coming in. We see a general reduction of fleet because people are just simply not needing so many cars anymore. Now, the LCV sector is not so much influenced by that at the moment. Actually, it looks like LCVs are growing, especially maybe also due to the higher demand for delivery due to that pandemic that we're facing at this moment. But the key message is there are quite a number of valuable best practices around that one could follow and that one could take good examples for. And if you follow all these things, then you will for sure get to the lowest TCO by measuring, monitoring, and adapting. And here's my last tip. Once this whole thing is done, start from the beginning, because there's a constant change and it will always help. So we hope that what we were able to share with you today met your expectations, that you found the one or another topic which really triggered your attention. We'd be very happy to answer any questions. And so here, the stage back to
Dieter.
Dieter, thank you.
It's not a very common name, but thank you very much, Samuel, and thank you very much, Madelaine, for your compelling presentation about TCO. I thought I knew TCO, and then I was witness of this presentation. Of course, I knew what was in it as we prepared this, but I must say it was really interesting, really enlightening. And well, I think especially in terms of LCV fleet, now that we are going towards electric mobility, it's a very complicated matter. It has become very complex, and fortunately there are partners out there such as Fleet Logistics that can help fleets transition to e-mobility, draw up the baseline and start from there. And indeed, as you briefly mentioned at the end, Samuel, it's about starting from the beginning and keep an eye on what's changing. So thank you very much indeed for your presentation, Madelaine and Samuel. We can now start with the Q&A session of today's Deep Dive webinar. And we have already collected a few questions in our chat function. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you still have questions, do not hesitate. So use the chat function to the right-hand side of your screen, and please submit us your questions, and we will try to answer them within the time frame that we still have left, which is about 15 minutes from now. So the first question that I would like to discuss, I don't know who's going to answer this, Madelaine or Samuel, but it's a question from Ronald de Haan, and he wants to know, where is insurance in the TCO true baseline? So where's insurance in the TCO between brackets true baseline?
Yeah, if I may, I would be happy to answer that. It's a very good question, and I think it's one of the most important questions there is. Insurance plays quite a substantial part of the overall costs that you have for your vehicles. And we all know insurance will become expensive when there are lots of accidents. So first of all, yes, you can, of course, evaluate if you want to do general insurance. You can also think about, and that's really something one should really consider, as per a certain amount of vehicles in your fleet, you might really start considering to insure, to avoid insurance and cover these costs yourself. In some countries, and it's really, you have to really look at the details, but in some countries, the tax on insurance is so high. If you have, let's say, 1,000 vehicles running, just from paying the tax for insurance, you can have a certain high amount of total fails or total damages where you would lose the complete car just to cover the taxes. So you have a certain break even where you say, okay, I can lose 5 cars every year completely and I still have saved money because that's just the taxes I've paid and not even the insurance rate yet. So that's something you really have to consider and think about. But something Madelaine mentioned before, which is very important, is also the driver training. One of the main cost factors in the TCM or with insurance usually are the windshields. If you really look and talk to your insurer, and you will find out what are the main costs. It's either the parking or it's the windshields. And there are such simple suggestions or simple trainings that will just help to reduce those costs. If the windshield costs go down, your overall insurance ratio will also go down, which means your overall cost for your full fleet will also drop. And a simple solution can be just tell your drivers, please do not follow big trucks that are loaded with sand or gravel or anything of that kind, because these things usually always break your windshields. This might sound like a very simple and basic input, but it does have an impact. And this is where we actually talk about, you should really think about what is written in your policy. How much can you steer your drivers in being considerate of certain things like that? I hope this answers the question.
I hope so too. If not, Ronald, please let us know through the chat function. I have a second question. This one comes from Amélie, and I hope I pronounced it right. De Val-Roger. I suppose it's a French name. So Amélie, she asks us, do you include home charging costs in your TCO, if any? So I'm sure that's a very relevant question in today's LCV management. Madelaine, Samuel, who would like to take this question? So do you include home charging costs in your TCO, if any?
Is it okay, Madelaine, if I answer this one also? This is a very new field. To be honest, everybody speaks about electric vehicles in their fleet, but when you look at the details, and I think also the overview, when we look at the trends, we saw, yes, there is a growth, but not really yet. So when we talk about, is there a holistic approach for most of the customers or most of the big fleets to have that already implemented? The number is very little, it's very small. So we're still starting in this area. But definitely, yes, it should be included. However, the topic is, how can you find a solution that will work? It's almost impossible to finding a solution that will offer home charging on a European-wide scope, right? If it's just a local one in each country itself, you will find very nice solutions which provide very good overviews of the real costs at home. I mean, you got smart cables where you wouldn't even need a wall box at home anymore. The smart cable really gives you all the details of what has been charged, and you can simply then balance the costs of your home charging with the company. That is something which I think is groundbreaking, because usually the question is, who's going to pay those 2,000 to 3,000 euros of costs of the real implementation costs of the home charging? The charging point itself costs maybe 700-800 euros if you get a cheap one, but then you also need the electrician to come. You need to set up all the things. So you probably are more or less somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 euros. Now with a smart cable, that's much easier. But to come back to your initial question, it should be included, of course, absolutely. And this is something that is in the making, I would say. There's still new technology coming as we speak.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that these costs for home charging will come down in the coming years? Because I mean, it's relatively expensive. I mean, you talk about 2,000 to 3,000 euros. That represents a large portion in your TCO. What are your expectations in this area?
The cost will definitely go down. That's for sure. I mean, just if you think about a smart cable costs between 900 and 1,200 euros, and then you would not need much more than just a strong power plug in your wherever you want to charge, right? So these costs already have, it's already only 50% of what it used to be like 3 or 4 years ago, when that technology wasn't known so much yet. The key question really is, who should be covering for these costs? And that's again where we said, before you start to evaluate if you want to reduce your costs or how you can reduce your costs, it's really what's the goal. And by doing a certain type of driver profiling and checking out with those drivers who would be interested in something like this, sometimes or most of the times they would be even willing to cover for a certain amount of these costs. Because the question really is, if I implement such a thing at home, the question is, who's owning it? As soon as it is directly connected to your private property, you are the owner. So the company will will always have an issue, because at the moment this person might leave the company for whatever reason. What's going to happen with that equipment? Send somebody there and have mounted off, cost maybe just as much as just leaving it there. So perhaps certain employees would be even willing to say, I'm happy to share half of the cost, and if it runs for 5 years, it's fine, it will be mine. That's something that really has to be considered. And again, here's not one solution fits for all, but that's what we meant with there's a massive change happening.
All right, thank you. Another question about electric commercial vehicles. So residual value represents at least 50% of TCO. That's what Stefan Denis tells us in his message. So RVs, about 50% or more in TCO. What about electric LCV? Is the RV percentage similar? I mean, the ratio of the RV in the TCO, is it similar? Is it higher? Is it lower? What can we expect from ELCV in terms of RV compared to ICE vehicles?
Will I take this one,
question, I think.
Please go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we need to remember this is an emerging market, and it will vary market to market with how developed that particular area is in terms of the infrastructure and the product availability. However, I think the thing to think about, and I don't know how this particular business runs their maintenance, however, as the vehicle ages, there's less parts in an ELCV, so there's less maintenance on it. So perhaps even it's worth looking at how the residual values impact on rentals over different payment terms, because once you get to the 3 or 4 years, then it will help with the cost will come down at that point, because there's not as much maintenance in these vehicles. And I think as we start to learn more about them as well, that only helps the residual value as well. The more demand, it's demand, isn't it, as well, that plays a big part. And we're seeing demand increase all the time as companies really engage on the sustainability journey.
All right. I have a question coming in from Johan Verbois. Hi, Johan. Nice to see you here. Johan, we all know you as a remarketing expert, so your question is, of course, remarketing related. LCV customers often handle vehicles at risk. So his question is, what would be your advice or best practices for these customers to maximize residual value and or remarketing?
Is it okay if I answer this one?
Yeah, okay.
I had actually a practical experience with that. A customer had the very same topic. They said, we have a high risk because the costs are quite high. We get hardly any money for these vehicles when we return them. Now, they had a leasing engagement, and that specific leasing company was just using a standard online platform, of course, specialized in passenger cars. So those LCV cars, which would also come on that platform to be resold, it never really hit high values. Obviously, the lease rate was quite low. The lease rate was quite high due to those high residual values, because the leasing company couldn't sell them for a proper price. And over time, they've learned that. So once that was investigated, the idea was, well, we need to find a field that is actually interested in these LCVs. It's obviously not that platform where usually people go who are looking for passenger cars. And then by talking to the dealerships selling those LCVs, those specialized retailers, the lesson was very quickly learned that these dealers had a high interest in actually getting those cars back, because obviously every potential customer coming into their dealership is looking for an LCV, and then to get a 3 or 4 year old LCV that comes from a leasing is quite interesting, because usually service is done perfectly, maintenance was done always fine and nice. You have relatively good quality of LCVs. In that case, that was really so. So all of a sudden, the residual value was at least a third, if not even 50% higher than it used to before, simply because there was now a more interested field of potential buyers for these vehicles. Now that may be one example. The other one, when we talk about the real big risks, sometimes we also know LCVs are driven until they fall apart, right? And sometimes that may be also the right solution, right? If you learn that after 3 or 4 years you don't get hardly any money anymore for these types of car, well then keep on driving them, but please keep in mind what are my maintenance costs. As long as they are relatively low, or if they don't hit a certain mark, it can be quite lucrative to keep these cars and keep them running. Of course, everything under the circumstance that safety is not in any jeopardy here, but really to drive such a vehicle then much longer can also help that you really minimize that risk of just paying into the residual value.
Indeed. All right. I have a question from Jean-Luc de Flandre. I hope that I can convey the message or the question correctly, because to me it's a bit cryptic. So he says, will we have one day a relation between really good TCO and financial governmental sponsoring? Question: less taxes if higher TCO. Does that make any sense, Samuel or Madelaine? To me, I'm afraid for me it's a bit cryptic. So financial governmental sponsoring, so less taxes if higher TCO.
Higher TCO.
I really want to find that country who does that.
Yeah.
So maybe Jean-Luc, if you hear us, could you perhaps try to rephrase the question, because it's a bit enigmatic to us. But thank you anyway for submitting it. I have another question, and that's about comparing acquisition costs and financing costs. That's of course a very interesting one. So how can you compare? How do you compare acquisition costs and finance costs?
Well, will I take this one, Samuel?
Please go for it.
Okay. So I think it's going back to the process that we talked through. So identifying roughly what is the product capability that you require. So is it ELCV? Is it can you manage with a 1.6 engine instead of a 2 litre? Do you need the full capacity of the vehicles that you're using? And then going out to the tender to make sure that you've got the right OEMs at the right discount levels, and then taking that information to your leasing companies. Again, I would recommend a tender for that as well, depending on your fleet size. But that will allow you then to benchmark the market. So you benchmark the OEMs to start with in terms of pricing, product capability. Then you're benchmarking your costs of either buying the vehicle or leasing the vehicle between your different providers. And I would say to do that in different markets as well. Yes, it's an international exercise, but you may find that the results do differ in different markets, and it's worth doing that periodically, not just once every 3 years.
All right, thank you. In the meantime, Jean-Luc has paraphrased his question. So if proven better TCO, then governments are giving subsidies, for example, in Holland, but not everywhere in Europe. So if the TCO is proven to be better, then governments should give subsidies, something along those lines. Is that something that you agree, or that you can comment on?
It's definitely interesting. It's an interesting thought, and I hope I understand the question here correctly. When we talk about the TCO, we've got different components in it, right? If it's just the financial parts, I don't see how a government would be willing to support that in a way. But if that is connected to sustainability and connecting TCO with better sustainability as well, I could see that to really make sense. Because if you are able to reduce these costs in a way that it also has a sustainable aspect to it, I'm sure governments are willing to support this. And I think this is what's already happening anyway. If we take a close look, there are so many benefits, but it's always connected to sustainability, very seldomly on the real TCO or the real TCM. I hope I understood the question correctly. hard to really grasp what the real question here is.
Yeah, if Jean-Luc, if you are willing to discuss this matter, I'm sure Samuel can reply to your question after this session directly. So please feel free to reach out and contact Samuel. I have time for one last question, and that is the question: how do I minimize lost revenue or higher cost because of vehicle downtime? So basically, how do I reduce downtime and increase uptime?
Yes, that's a very good question. So if I understand it correctly, that means I think this question is probably referring to what we have now everywhere. Due to the pandemic, we have very strong downtimes in certain areas, and how can that be optimized? Well, I think the main learning is, and that's a learning that many of the lease companies hurts them, right? Because fleets are getting smaller. We realized that we don't need to be everywhere all the time anymore. I mean, this meeting alone is a perfect example where we would have been meeting in person for things like this sometimes. That's now all done online. We don't need the car anymore to go there. And I think in a way that's also what's been happening with LCVs. But maybe that question is more in the passenger car area. And I think we should just learn from our experience, and that's the point. We mentioned it before. With telematics, you can get a better understanding where you really have to go, how often you should be somewhere, and especially how am I optimally using a certain vehicle? Is it just standing around 90% of the time, or am I able to actively use it? And that's the key question, and that's what has to be done. You need to check the details. You need to check you need to check what's really happening within your fleet, and then make the brave decision maybe to reduce fleet and to pool or to do whatever is necessary with that, and that will bring benefits.
I know we're running out of time, but I've got some really good information on that that I can share. So if the person would like to email me directly, I'll send it across to them or get in touch via you.
Great. Thank you very much. Indeed, I'm afraid that's the end of our deep dive webinar today. It's 4 p.m., so it's time for us to round off. And in any case, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. And thank you indeed, Samuel and Madelaine and Fleet Logistics, for your sponsorship and for your enlightening and very compelling presentation today. I would like to remind you that you have a poll section to the right-hand side of your screen. So if you go to the poll section, please do us a favor and let us know what you thought about today's session, about the content, about the presentation. Always good for us to know whether we met your expectations and where we might improve for the next time, or if you have suggestions about topics, etc., please let us know. And that brings us to the end of the session, and there's only one thing left for me to say, that please join us again tomorrow, Friday, for the final session of the Fleet Week LCV, and the session tomorrow will be hosted by Sixt, and the theme of tomorrow is maximizing LCV utilization through flexibility. I'm sure indeed another very interesting presentation, so please join us tomorrow. That's it for me. So thank you for being here, and I wish you a very good afternoon, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you
very much.
Bye-bye.